cell phone sound.
You sit here.
I want to welcome you to the Joe R. Sexton lecture. Joe is very special to us. He volunteered for many years with his wife Ann, 10 years working on our Books for Babies program. And if you don't know about that, since 1986, we have made sure that every child who's born in Stanford gets a book as they're born. And it's the Friends of the Ferguson Library who run that program, and it's totally volunteer work. So when you support the Friends, that's one of the programs you're supporting. But this lecture series, somebody asked me earlier, how did we decide on this book? And I said, it's actually a process, because Joe was interested in everything. And so it gives us the ability to do a lot of eclectic topics, although we've sort of landed on World War II through the Korean War. I'm not quite sure why, but we've landed there. But he's very, very interested in a lot of different topics. We start reading books, and which ones are of interest, which ones do we think will make a great talk. And that's how we landed on our topic tonight of World War II correspondent Ernie Pyle. And I know you're going to love this talk. But this series would not have happened if it were not by a generous donation by Mel Klugman. And I just have to thank Mel, who's here tonight, for that donation. And as I say to people, if you have a clever idea, please call me. Because there is, if you want to dedicate money to a certain lecture series or a certain topic, I'm open to conversation. So please, please call me if you have a great idea. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Susan LaPerla, Director of Public Services.
Thank you, Alice. I try not to talk too long so that the mic lasts long enough to go through the whole presentation. But I'm here to introduce David to you. David Chrisinger is a faculty member at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, where he serves as the executive director of the Harris Writing Workshop, leads the Persuasive Writing Credential Program, and advises the student-led Chicago Public Policy Review. He is here tonight to speak to us about his book, The Soldier's Truth, Ernie Pyle and the Story of World War II, which chronicles the life and work of renowned war correspondent Ernie Pyle, the man who put a human face on the war for millions of Americans. A moving tribute to a humble American hero whose impact on the war is still too little understood, and a powerful reckoning with that war's impact on all who fought it. The Soldier's Truth makes an essential contribution to our understanding of what war is about and how we make sense of it. In addition to The Soldier's Truth, David is the author of Stories Are What Save Us. Here, he reflects on his journey as a writer, editor, and teacher, using a range of storytelling frameworks he and his students have used to process trauma and conflict and create stories of growth and transformation. David is a Logan Nonfiction Fellow and has contributed columns to the New York Times Magazine. He also regularly contributes to The War Horse, an award-winning nonprofit newsroom dedicated to educating the public on military service and war, as well as its impact. Please join me in welcoming David Chrisinger to the
It's always a little odd to hear your biography read. Is the mic working? Okay. I'll use my lecturer voice. It's always a little odd to hear your biography read in front of you. It also makes it sound like, when does this guy sleep? I promise that I do. Now, before tonight, I'm curious, how many people were fans of Ernie Pyle before they? Okay, just a couple. How many people knew about Ernie Pyle? All right, more so now. I can tell you the exact day that I learned about Ernie Pyle. Ernie Pyle, the exact day that I learned about Ernie was Memorial Day weekend, 2016. And I was in Okinawa, Japan, doing research about my grandfather, who was a World War II soldier. He was a tank driver in the Army, and he served during the Battle of Okinawa. He tells the story that when he got drafted, he went to the processing center, and they said, well, what was your job before the war? And he said, well, I was a farmer. And they said, can you drive a tractor? I said, yes, sir. He said, great, you can drive a tank then. And that's how he ended up in tank school, and then ended up in the Battle of Okinawa, which was the longest and the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. It was the last battle right before the Allies dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I was there because, like a lot of men in my grandfather's generation, he didn't talk very much about his experiences. Although we knew that the war had had a profound effect on him, we just didn't know really how or why. And so as the family historian and as the only trained historian in the family, I sort of took it on as a side project to try to uncover the history and the stories that my grandfather experienced. So I was in Okinawa, and I hired this historian who was local to the area, who could take me around to the different battlefield sites and the different memorials and sort of give me a better picture, a better understanding of again, what my grandfather experienced. The last place he took me was to the Cornerstone of Peace. So if you've ever been to DC and you've seen the Vietnam Memorial Wall, you know the black granite, there are over 58,000 names inscribed on the wall. In the Cornerstone of Peace, there are 240,000 names inscribed. That includes all of the Japanese defenders, all of the Okinawan civilians who lost their lives, and also all of the Americans who were killed. So it does not matter what side of the conflict you were on. If you died during the battle, your name is inscribed on one of these walls. And this is just one small section of the memorial. It radiates out like waves at the southernmost point of the island of Okinawa. This is where that memorial is located. So this is a really great mosaic map that you can find at the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii that tells the story of the Pacific War. So this is the island of Okinawa. You can see this big blue arrow here, kind of in the middle. This is the landing forces, the majority of the Army and the Marines that landed on the first day of the battle, which was April 1st, 1945, April Fool's Day. It was April Fool's Day especially because the Japanese defenders changed up their tactics for the Battle of Okinawa. So during the Battle of Iwo Jima and other island campaigns, the Japanese defenders tried to attack the Americans as they were landing. During the Battle of Okinawa, they reversed strategies and they let the Americans land unopposed. And then what they did was they built a series of defensive lines. So you can see like this line here and this line here. They defended the southern half of the island, and the plan was very simple. They did not believe that they could win the battle. The Japanese officers that were in charge of the battle plan knew that they were going to lose, knew that every soldier on the island was likely to lose their life, and the whole point of their strategy was to try to bloody the Americans, was to try to make it so costly for them to win the battle that it will dissuade them from trying to invade the homeland of Japan. So the entire strategy of this battle was to kill as many as Americans as possible and to fight to the last man. And that's what the Japanese defenders did. So I was at like I said, I was at the memorial, and the tour guide said to me, the historian said to me, well, do you know any of the names of men that your grandfather served with that were killed during the battle? We could look their names up and you could take an etching just like you can in DC. And at that time, I didn't have that level of detail of my grandfather's unit or the day-to-day activities that they were a part of. And so I probably looked a little sheepish, and he said, don't worry, I'll take you to a name that surely you'll recognize. So he takes me over to this wall, and he points out the name Ernest Taylor Pyle. Now I can tell you, I did not know that name. The first thought I had was, is this the guy they named Gomer Pyle after? I kid you not. I remember watching the Gomer Pyle reruns with my dad when I was a kid. And that's not a crazy thing to think, because did you know on the Vietnam Wall that there is the name John Rambo and they used the name John Rambo in the Sylvester Stallone movies. So that's where my mind was like, oh, this was inspiration for this character. No, not at all. Obviously not. And the historian I was with, he looked at me like I had two heads. He could not believe that I didn't know who Ernie Powell was. And he said, let me get this straight. You're trying to understand what your grandfather experienced as a private in the Army. You're trying to understand what his day-to-day life was like. You flew 7,000 miles to retrace his steps, and you've never read Ernie Powell? And I felt embarrassed, right? Because I felt like here's this huge gap in my knowledge. And he said, do yourself a favor when you get home, buy everything you can buy on Ernie Powell, read his books, read his columns, read the biographies that have been written about him. It'll open up a whole new world to you. And that is exactly what happened. I went home, I found his books. He had two best-selling books. One was called Here's Your War, which covered his reporting from North Africa. And then he also had a book called Brave Men, which covered his reporting from Sicily, Italy, and France. And then after the war, some other collections were published. He did some reporting from England that was published in a collection. He did some reporting from the Pacific, obviously, that was published later. But he was mostly known for Here's Your War and Brave Men. Then I found that Hollywood made a movie about Ernie Powell, the story of G.I. Joe. And sometimes that's how people come to know Ernie Powell, is they've seen that movie. A young Burgess Meredith plays Ernie Powell, really kind of a spitting image, honestly. If you can imagine the trainer from the Rocky movies, right? That's kind of the look that Ernie Powell had. So I was doing all this research about him, and I was filling in the gaps around what had happened during the battle for my grandfather, and there were actually a lot of overlaps between what Ernie experienced during the battle and what my grandfather experienced. Because what happened was Ernie landed with these forces in this big blue arrow right here at that Habushi beach, and the Army soldiers went south, and they encountered some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War. The Marines went north, and there was much less resistance in the north, and they were able to kind of capture the northern half of the island fairly quickly. Any Marines in the room? Okay, so you'll like this. Any soldiers in the room? Okay, we can be honest then. So the soldiers, the Army had a heck of a time on the southern half of the island, and the Marines had to come and rescue the Army, according to the Marine version of the story. They had to come and rescue. Whoops, we lost it again. But what I found in Ernie's writing was really profound. He was essentially telling the soldiers' stories. He called himself a letter writer. He said, it's my job to write the letters home. And what he did was he wrote 6 columns a week for about 2.5 years during the war. Each column was between 800 and 1,000 words. So just imagine that, 6 days a week for years on end. And he wrote about everything. He wrote about the food, he wrote about the weather, he wrote about the landscape, he wrote about the local people, the sleeping conditions, what it was like to march through the middle of the night, what it was like to be bombed, what it was like to be shot at, all these things that the readers back home in America desperately wanted answers to, right? They wanted to understand what their sons or their husbands or their brothers or the kid down the street was likely experiencing, right? So Ernie really filled this very interesting niche that a lot of reporters sort of ignored. And now, I think about Ernie Powell and I think there's so much that we kind of take for granted about war reporting today, where war reporters will embed with a unit, right? And they'll stay with that unit for a week or 2 weeks or a month. Ernie Powell was the first correspondent to do that. That was not the standard operating procedure for most correspondents. Writing articles about individual soldiers, naming those soldiers, talking about where they came from, their hometowns. Sometimes Ernie would even put their address in a column, and people who read the column would then write letters to that family and say, I hope your son, is safe and gets home safe. And he really sort of started to build a community through his column, and people really started to believe that they knew him and that they were almost friends with him, that he was some kind of long distance relative, right? Writing those letters home. So I really fell in love with Ernie. I fell in love with his writing. I started teaching concepts that I picked up from studying Ernie's writing. And then This was the late winter of 2018. I was working as a columnist for New York Times Magazine, and they said that they were looking for stories for 2019 because 2019 was the 75th anniversary of a bunch of important things that happened during World War II, including the D-Day invasion of France. And so I raised my hand and I said, I have an idea for the D-Day series. Can I do it on Ernie Pyle? Can I do it on how Ernie Pyle reported from D-Day? And the editor said, oh yeah, Ernie Pyle. I remember learning about Ernie Pyle in journalism school. Yeah, do that. I said, great. Can you send me to Normandy? They said, not a chance. But where they did end up sending me was to Dana, Indiana, which is the Normandy of Indiana. But that's Ernie's hometown, Dana, Indiana. Now you have to try really hard to get there on purpose. There's no highway that goes near there. It's about 45 miles west of Bloomington, Indiana. It's a very small farming community. There's one stoplight, there's a post office, and there is the Ernie Pyle Museum. And it is a world-class museum, staffed by people who are world-class experts in Ernie Pyle. And I went down there on a reporting trip to just sort of trying to figure out what Ernie's story was. And what I found was that there was this just deep well of admiration and respect and love for Ernie Pyle that was 7, 8 decades old. And it really just struck me that there was something about this guy that really connected with people. So I wrote the piece about D-Day. It came out on a Tuesday. It was published online first. On Wednesday, on actual D-Day, I got an email from my editor and they said, you're not going to believe this, but 1 million people downloaded the article in the first 24 hours. They had no idea that so many people cared about Ernie Pyle. I started getting handwritten letters delivered to me at the university, emails from people. Somehow someone found my cell phone. I was getting text messages from people. From readers who said, I read your piece and I remember my dad talking about Ernie Pyle. Or I remember my grandfather was in a unit that Ernie Pyle embedded with and that he wrote about. And so that was Wednesday. On Thursday, I get a call from an editor at Penguin Press. And he says, I read your article about Ernie Pyle and I read the article you wrote about your grandfather. And if you ever want to write a book about Ernie Pyle, I'm all in. Now I can tell you, if you're not a writer and not an author, that is not how it usually goes. Normally you have to put together a proposal and query lots of agents and then get an agent to buy into your project, and then the agent has to sell it to an editor, and it's a very involved process and there's a lot of rejection. And here this was, this story reached so many people that even this book editor is reaching out to me and saying, hey, if you want to write about this, let's talk. So I got on the phone with him, and he said to me, well, how would you do this exactly? Like, there have been other biographies of Ernie Pyle. I wouldn't be the first person to write about him. What would I do that's different? And I had thought about, I knew I was going to get this question, but I said, I think I'd want to do kind of what I did with my grandfather. I want to retrace Ernie's steps. I want to go to all the places where he served and where he wrote from, and I want to see what those things look like today, and I want to see, what do we know now that we didn't know then? How good of a reporter was he? Did he really capture the essence of these different situations he found himself in? And then I said, but I want to also do it with a little twist I call the Tony Horwitz twist. And if you know the name Tony Horwitz, he wrote a book called Confederates in the Attic. And this was a really amazing book, came out in the late 90s, where he wanted to answer the question, why are people still so obsessed with the Civil War? Right? What is it about the Civil War that just captivates people? And to help answer this question, he became a Civil War reenactor. And he traveled to all these different battlefields, and he got to know people who really take the Civil War seriously, and he incorporated that into the book to this really great effect. And so I said, I kind of want to do that. I want to figure out why people are still so in love with Ernie Pyle after all these years. Then there was a very long pause. And I thought, that's it. I took my swing, and I missed. And he's going to tell me thanks, but no thanks. And what seemed like an eternity passed. And then he said, well, I was Tony's editor. And I said, no, I did not know that. I promise you, I did not know that. But I think part of it was like, this guy's good, right? He's playing me now, right? He said, no, I had no idea. And what gets really spooky about this is Tony Horwitz had just passed away about a week before this call. He had a brain aneurysm, he was on tour, had aneurysm, dropped dead. It was just totally out of the blue. And my editor had actually just come from the funeral the day before. And so he said, I would love for there to be another Tony Horwitz in the world. I will help you with this. Let's do it. Let's write this book. So that is the sort of maiden voyage that I went from thinking Ernie Pyle was Gomer Pyle in 2016 to writing about him during D-Day in 2019 to writing this book. It's been a whirlwind, and it's been a really exciting adventure. And I'm so pleased to be here to talk with you about Ernie. And what I'd like to do now is I have a few pages from the book that I'd like to read, and then I have some slides to kind of show you how the process of writing the book came together, including some of the travel that I got to do. Now, I have a very good writer friend, an author, who told me, if you ever go to a book event and the author reads from something that's not the first page of the book, that they started the book in the wrong place. Is this it? All right. So this is, there, that's better. So this is from page 1 of The Soldier's Truth. A warm summer rain soaked the men as they mounted muddy tanks and stuffed themselves into half-tracks or jeeps pointed east. The smell of soggy gear and idling engines overpowered the sweet scent of the honeysuckle that climbed the gray siding of a nearby 3-story inn. In a darkened shed, out behind the inn, a 43-year-old pipe cleaner of a man sat hunched over his portable typewriter, ankle deep in straw, his back curved like a cashew. This morning we are sort of stymied as far as movement is concerned, he pecked out with his index fingers to his wife back home in New Mexico. So in order not to waste the day, I dug up a white metal table out of a nearby garden. After nearly 3 months of hellish fighting through the hedgerow country of France, the Americans and their allies were 30 miles from the center of Nazi-occupied Paris. Capturing Paris had never been part of the Allies' plan, which involved a strike through to the Low Countries, across the industrial heartland of Germany, and straight to the heart of Berlin. The Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had grave concerns that if he marched his men into Paris, they would likely bog themselves down in brutal street-by-street combat with seasoned enemy troops and reduce one of the world's most magnificent cities to a charred graveyard. Not even an impassioned plea from the French commander, General Charles de Gaulle, had been able to dissuade him. Then, on August 22, 1944, the French Resistance's Chief of Staff, Roger Gaulois, slipped through the German lines on the outskirts of Paris and found his way to General George S. Patton's headquarters. The situation on the ground was not what the Americans thought, Gaulois told General Omar Bradley's chief intelligence officer. The resistance movement in the capital city had infiltrated the police force, and the week before, 15,000 Parisian policemen had gone on strike. More than that, the tens of thousands of resistance fighters had risen up to attack and harass their Nazi occupiers, even though they were armed with not much more than antique rifles and Molotov cocktails. In the days following the police strike, many more Parisians of all ages and abilities dug up paving stones, collected piles of furniture and other odds and ends, and felled trees to construct an elaborate network of more than 400 street blockades. Even though they were outnumbered and now outmaneuvered, the Germans were nowhere near outgunned, and would eventually crush the insurrection and inflict untold amounts of suffering and destruction as they retreated east, unless the Allies came to the rescue. This new intelligence quickly reached Eisenhower, who dispatched the Free French forces under his command to liberate their capital with American and British backup, while the rest of his forces pushed east and north toward the Belgian border. On August 25, 1944, Liberation Day in Paris, after a brilliant sun burned away the morning mist, Ernest Taylor Pyle,
better known as Ernie to his millions of readers back home in America, stuffed his typewriter into its case, slung his musette bag over his shoulder, and hopped into a Jeep with a couple of fellow combat newspapermen. Through most of the early part of the day, they felt their way through garden-like country toward the outskirts of Paris, far behind the lead tanks and the more daring Allied correspondents, such as Robert Capa, Ernest Hemingway, and Don Whitehead. The outer rings of the city hadn't been bombed much, Ernie was heartened to find, and most of the bridges were still safe to cross. Not at all desperate to be the first to secure that coveted liberated Paris dateline under their bylines, Ernie and his companions entered the city from the south, along the Rue d'Orléans, where they discovered a pandemonium of surely the greatest mass joy that has ever happened. Women in brightly colored blouses and skirts lined the wide city streets in a carnival-like frenzy, leaving only a narrow corridor of pavement for the hulking military vehicles to navigate. Aging veterans of the Franco-Prussian War stood at attention, saluting their liberators. Excited children bounced and waved. Some ran along jeeps with their hands extended, hoping for a shake, but settling for slaps on the back or pats on the shoulder. The demented choir of shrieking shells and zipping machine gun tracers the Allies had expected to encounter that day had mostly been replaced by cheers of Vive la France and Vive l'Amérique, even as pockets of German resistance in the city remained. They tossed flowers and friendly tomatoes into our Jeep, Ernie later reported. One little girl even threw a bottle of cider into ours. Once, when the Jeep was simply swamped in human traffic and had to stop, he wrote, we were swarmed over and hugged and kissed and torn at. Everybody, even beautiful girls, insisted on kissing you on both cheeks. At least one ecstatic woman with full pompadour and flashy earrings reached out to grab Ernie by the slack in his collar. Before he could protest, she pulled his gray bearded face, smudged with dust and lipstick, to her wine-colored lips. Thank you, oh thank you, she squealed between kisses. Thank you for coming. We all got kissed until we were literally red in the face, he later recalled, and I must say we enjoyed it. At long last, Ernie's ability to relish in the beauty of the world at war, something he feared might have atrophied inside his chest, suddenly flickered back to life. After inching through so much gratitude and joy for about an hour, Ernie had the driver pull over in front of a hotel near the Luxembourg Palace, across the river from the Louvre. They'd heard scuttlebutt that there were any number of desperate Germans holed up in the palace, firing indiscriminately at anything wearing green. While others fought, Ernie and two United Press correspondents wrote their first dispatches from Paris in a room overlooking the street below. I had thought for me there could never again be any elation in war, Ernie wrote of that joyous day. But I had reckoned without the liberation of Paris. I had reckoned without remembering that I might be part of this richly historic day. The day after the city was liberated, Ernie and his crew puttered over the Seine and past the Place de la Concorde and the gardens of the Champs-Élysées. From there, they meandered their way to the gilt-edged Grand Hotel, across the street from the Allied press camp that was taking shape inside Hotel Scribe. Like Mary and Joseph, when Ernie and his companions arrived at the Scribe, they were told that there was no more room at the inn. Not long after the Nazi propaganda officers who had occupied the hotel had fled, some 200 Allied correspondents, under an emotional tension, a pent-up semi-delirium, moved in and set up shop. Through the gilded lobby of the Grand Hotel, up a set of marble stairs and down the carpeted hallway all the way to the corner, Ernie found a room with clean sheets but no electricity. From the balcony 3 floors above the street, he grinned down in the afternoon sun at the joyous abandon below. After so much darkness, grateful Parisians had found the light. Standing there with several other correspondents, in as genteel a way as his tongue could muster, Ernie quipped that any GI who doesn't get laid tonight is a sissy. As the sun began to set, Ernie and his buddies made their way back across to the street and claimed a table near the bar on the far side of the room. The booze did what Ernie wanted it to. It dissolved him. Soon, a couple of dozen war correspondents had him encircled, eager to hear a tale or two from the little man everyone loved so much. At one point, the other famous Ernie, that's Hemingway, bellied up to the opposite end of the bar with the swagger of a lonely warlord, seemingly resentful of Pyle's command of his hangers-on. Slap! Hemingway stung the air with a heavy hand on the bar top. A grenade he carried with him, just in case, pulled on the inside pocket of his field jacket. Let's have a drink here, he spat from the corner of his bearded mouth. The bartender babysitting Ernie and his buddies turned. Hemingway motioned for him. I'm Ernest Hemorrhoid, he roared across the room. The rich man's Ernie Pyle. He was such a character, wasn't he? Around 11 o'clock, in between rounds of cocktails, air raid sirens wailed, snapping everyone back to reality. In a raid of vicious retaliation, German bombers flew low over the rejoicing city, dropping their payloads and strafing anything that moved. Back suddenly was the little knot of fear in Ernie's stomach. Back was the animal-like alertness for meaning of every distant sound. Back was the perpetual weight on his spirit that comes with death and dirt and noise and anguish. Ernie realized he had reached his limit. What should have felt like a gigantic relief, celebrating the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, had become yet another opportunity to die. The German air raid killed as many as 200 people who probably thought that their war was over. Another 900 were wounded. The next day, Ernie sent a telegram to his longtime editor, dear friend, and business manager, Lee Miller. About done up, he said. Physically, everything was fine. But Ernie was bogged down inside and could barely keep the columns going. The final German raid had brought home the truth. He was wrung out. There was nothing left to give. It was time to come home. Now, I think we're going to try to get the slides back up. But you know, the big question for me when I was writing the piece about Ernie for the New York Times was, if he goes home from Paris and he knows that he's basically done all he can do and that the war has taken so much from him and how much more can he possibly give, then what possibly possessed him to go cover the war in the Pacific? That ultimately cost him his life. That was the question that I wanted to try to figure out initially. And you know, what I came to realize was that Ernie's life was a lot more complicated than the life that I understood from reading about him and reading, you know, previous treatments of him. Ernie was probably one of the most unlikeliest people that I can think of to become a war correspondent, sort of on paper, right? I call him a pipe cleaner of a man. He was very small. He weighed about 110 pounds. When the war started, he was 41 years old. He was very concerned that when the war started that he was going to be drafted. And some people say, well, what do you mean? Why would he get drafted? He's 41 years old. Well, when the war started, the army was very small, and it was in desperate need of professionals, including doctors, lawyers, accountants, you know, those sorts of people, and also newspapermen were being drafted in order to become press officers or to become censors. And so Ernie was pretty convinced that he was eventually going to be drafted. He also didn't have kids, which was another reason why he thought he might be more susceptible to the draft. And it was a fear in the back of his mind that he would get drafted and that he would sit behind a typewriter at some base for the rest of the war and that he wouldn't really have any impact on it. So he had to kind of figure out a plan for what he was going to do. Now, nobody was saying to him, hey Ernie, why don't you go be a war correspondent? Now, the way this came about, being a war correspondent was actually kind of his fourth career within newspaper, within journalism. So he did not graduate. he went to college at Indiana University in Bloomington. He did not graduate though, he dropped out in the last semester because he got his first reporting job. And in his mind, or at least what he told his parents was, I only went to college so I could get a job, and now I have a job, so why should I go to college? Different time, probably. So he became a beat reporter. He worked doing daily news stories. He eventually moved to Washington, D.C. He joined a paper there. He was very successful as a reporter. He rose up through the ranks to become an editor. He actually became a managing editor of a newspaper. And partly why he rose through the ranks so quickly was that he was really good at writing concisely and clearly. And he was really good at editing other people who were not very good at being concise and clear. So he had a real talent for that. And but he also didn't really like being a manager. He didn't like micromanaging people. He didn't like giving them assignments. He didn't like the paperwork and the finances and all of the rest. And so to sort of capture the creative spirit that he started what I believe is the country's first column about the early days of aviation in the Washington, D.C. area. And he wrote stories about Amelia Earhart and all the famous pilots from the 20s and the 30s. And in fact, Amelia Earhart once said, if you're in the aviation industry and you're not friends with Ernie Pyle, then you're not anybody. So Ernie was writing this column about aviation. And then he got an idea to become a roving correspondent. And he had to give up his managing editor job. And he said, what I want to do is I want to just drive all around the country and I want to write stories. And everyone thought he was crazy because remember, this is the Depression. There's no interstate highway system. Cars are not very reliable. You might not find a gas station, by the time you run out. But he and his wife, Geraldine, everyone called her Jerry, they set out on basically a 7-year journey to crisscross the country 35 times. They visited every single state, including Alaska and Hawaii. He went to most of the provinces of Canada. He went to every country in Central America. He went to lots of countries in South America, and he wrote basically a travel column where he would find stories and find interesting people and find interesting experiences and write about them. And he did this, again, 6 days a week for 7 years. If you tally all that up, it equals about 31 books of material. If you count a book as about 100,000 words, 31 books he wrote in 7 years, incredible. And so when the war came, right, it was almost like this perfect storm. It's like he was good at writing clearly and concisely. He is a famous aviation columnist and he's friends with all these pilots, which guess what? Now they're overseas in the Air Corps, right? And he's been everywhere, he's talked to everybody, he's seen everything. So when he goes overseas to England and he starts meeting the soldiers, he just keeps doing that same work that he was doing as a roving correspondent, looking for interesting people, looking for interesting things, writing those stories, those letters home. And so when the war started, Ernie found himself in this crossroads because his wife was very ill at this time. And I talked to 2 doctors, psychiatrists, who, there's obviously a lot of, it's not easy to diagnose someone that you've never met and that who's been gone for a long time, but when I described the symptoms that she experienced and the things that happened to her, both doctors said it sounded like she had bipolar disorder. Now this would have been before that was a diagnosis, before there was any medication. And in fact, I could have written another book about just the insane medical treatments that Jerry was subjected to. At one point, her doctors recommended that she drink half a pint of whiskey before bed. That would help. She was prescribed barbiturates that she got addicted to. She was prescribed bromides, which I had to do some research about why you would prescribe that to somebody. It was something that they thought would help, but didn't. She also was subjected to electric shock therapy. She was institutionalized several times. It was very hard for her to have a husband who had to go away to do his job. And so this was something that was pulling on Ernie as well, but it's that sort of conflict between your duty to your country and your duty to your family. What sort of tips the scale for him is his doctor, Jerry's doctor, recommends that they get divorced to shock her out of her depression. Again, they did not know what they were doing. purpose. They were later remarried because it didn't help, obviously, for him to divorce her. But he basically was trying to escape when the war started. And I sometimes say, in the beginning, Ernie needed the war. By the end, the war needed Ernie. And he gave so much over the course of those 2.5 years. So he goes to England, and he starts doing his job, he starts reporting, and his draft board gives him notice that he has 6 months before they're going to reevaluate his status. So he has basically 6 months to be overseas. And when that 6 months comes up, his column has gotten so popular, and there are so many people reading it, that his draft board gave him a non-deferral deferral, which basically meant they thought what he was doing was helping the war effort more than anything he could have done as a soldier. And so they sort of promised him that he wouldn't be drafted. And I think that was part of it too, right? Was that he had a fear that he wasn't pulling his weight, that he wasn't doing everything he could to help win the war. And it's that pull on him again that makes it hard for him to stay home. Now, I told you about Okinawa. In France, this picture we used for the cover of the book, and for one particular reason, is that I don't think he knew he was having his picture taken. And I'm going to show you a bunch of other pictures of Ernie, and you're going to see the difference of when the photographers are sort of telling him where to stand, and there are lots of sort of posed, very curated type images. This one, I don't think he knew he was having his picture taken, and there's almost a vulnerability about him, right? He's sitting in this apple orchard outside of a chateau in Normandy, France, and he has decided that he's going home. He's going to take a break from the war, but he's got to finish his last columns before he can go home. And I think, I can't prove it, but I think this is capturing that sort of hurrying up and finishing his writing before he's able to go home. And there's just something that I think really about this image that really captures who he was as a human being. Now, this chateau is still there, and they have a shrine dedicated to Ernie Pyle, which you can see in the upper right hand here. So in the upper left, this is the outside of the chateau. This is where the correspondents during World War II were actually stationed in the chateau. If you look on the bottom right here, that's the owner of the chateau who was a little boy during World War II and got to meet Ernie Pyle and remembers shaking his hand, and even offered to let me shake his hand so that I could say that, I had indirectly shook hands with Ernie Pyle. Over here, this is my dear friend Jennifer. She's a historian. She lives in France. She was my translator. I took 2 years of French in college, but that is nowhere near enough French to be able to converse with French people, I found out. So it was really great to have someone who's had that history lens, but also could obviously speak the languages. But the real kick for me was that there's this poster hanging in the room where the correspondents worked in the chateau. And you can see they didn't even change the floor. The floor is the same.
No.
And right up here, I'm going to try to point. Right up here is Ernie, and he's hunched over his typewriter, and they said, craft the same pose, do an Ernie Pyle pose. And this is one of the tables that the correspondents used. This was a typewriter that was left over. I mean, they really kind of kept all of this stuff going after all these years, right? That there are people out there who still have a connection with Ernie. we keep losing the images. Now, I'd say the portion of the trip, so my research started before the pandemic started. And I was able to travel to North Africa, I was able to travel to Sicily, and I was in Italy about a week before the country shut down for COVID. So I left. Now, sometimes I wonder, would it have been so bad to get locked in Italy for a little while? I don't know. But I'm sure my wife and kids would not have appreciated me being gone for a year in Italy, trapped. But I returned home, so I was able to, at the height of the pandemic, I had all of my research and all of my field notes from the first trips. I started basically writing the book way sooner than I thought I was. I was planning to do the research first and then write. but I had to kind of break it up, obviously, because of the pandemic. So I wrote half of the book, and then turned that into my editor as kind of a gut check of like, I'm on the right path here. And he said, yep, full steam ahead. As soon as you can start traveling again, let's finish the rest of this. Once the vaccines came out, I was able to go to France. That's where the pictures from the chateau came from. I did a bunch of incredible things. Everywhere I went, people had a story about their family's interaction with American soldiers, about the ways that that their village, was treated under Nazi occupation and when it was liberated. Lots of people knew about Ernie Pyle. Ernie is sort of a revered character in France, which I didn't realize before going on these trips. And in fact, one of my favorite stories is we went to this very little village called Le Pieu. I think I'm saying that right. I have a painfully Midwestern accent, if you can't tell, but I think that's how they pronounce it in France. And the reason we went there was because this was a one-road village. It had one road down the downtown. And during the battle, Ernie and Robert Capa, the famous photographer, were basically sick of army rations. And so they decided they were going to go out and see if they could find some real French food. So they brought a bunch of K rations and C rations and things with them, and they wanted to trade with some of the French people. And they go to this little pub in Le Pieu, and they have this amazing meal with the French family that runs it. Robert Capa speaks 8 languages, none of them well, was the joke went, but he could speak French well enough to have conversations with the owners. And Ernie wrote this really touching article about it. So we decided we were going to try to find this pub, right? And we don't know if we found the exact pub, but we did find the pub in Le Pieu. And they told us the story of this drink that they invented in the summer of 1944 that they called 44. Now, in Normandy, they have this apple brandy they're very famous for. And Ernie, in one of his columns, wrote that any American soldier who drinks this apple brandy should be awarded a Purple Heart because it was so harsh going down. So the villagers, they wanted to, be able to make a little money off of the soldiers that were stationed nearby, and they said, well, they don't like our apple brandy, so what can we do instead? So they invented this drink. And this owner of this pub is telling me all about how they make it, and they still make it to this day. Now, the way you make this is you take a mason jar, a big one, and you peel an orange, and you stab that orange 44 times with a paratrooper knife, and it has to be a paratrooper knife, because paratrooper knives were designed to leave a bigger wound so it wouldn't close up. I didn't know that until he's showing me while stabbing an orange. And then in each one of those stab wounds, you insert a coffee bean. Then you drop that into the jar, and then you add 44 spoonfuls of sugar. And then you fill up the rest with the apple brandy. And then you let it sit for 44 days, and that's where it got the name 44. And I can tell you, this stuff is good. It is very good. Right, because you get the caffeine, you get the alcohol, you get the sugar. It's like everything Americans love, right? All wrapped into one. And they sold this to the soldiers, and the soldiers, some of them would use it to help them stay up at night. It has that added bonus. But everywhere I went, there were stories about Ernie Pyle, and there were people that remembered the impact that he had. When I went to North Africa, I had never been there before. I was the only white person that I saw for 10 days. Like, I didn't obviously see myself, but you know what I mean. And I'm 6'4", and I stand out with my red hair in a predominantly Muslim country, and or Arab country. And everywhere we went, I had to check in with the police station and tell them that I was safe, because they're very concerned about Western tourists being abducted or being harmed, because there are still insurgencies that fight the government forces in Tunisia. And in fact, on my last night there, we were at this little cafe that's at the bottom of, oh, there we go, we're back. Okay, so here's Ernie in Tunisia. Now, this is one of those maps from the cemetery in North Africa where American soldiers are buried. We have these great mosaics again that show how the different battles played out. And these green arrows here, these are the British forces that are coming up from Egypt and Libya, and they're pushing the Germans up into Tunisia. The red arrows are the Americans who are coming in from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and they're pushing west to east. And the point that they were trying to do was sort of trap the Germans in a pincer movement. That was the idea. Now, Rommel, the famous German general, he decides he's not going to let that happen, and he decides to take on the American forces for really the first time in World War II. And the American forces did not do so well. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was a pretty embarrassing loss for the Americans. They eventually rebounded and pushed the Germans all the way to the ocean where they surrendered. But this was the first time the Americans had gotten into a fight with the Germans, and it was pretty bad. And Ernie really found himself in a tough spot because he had to navigate military censorship while also trying to tell the truth about what he was seeing. So the one time that I can find evidence that a line was cut out of one of Ernie's stories that he was actually upset about was the line he said, "Never before have so many great men been led by so many incompetent men." And the censors cut that out. They said, that's not gonna fly. Now, military censorship at this time, they basically had these different categories that they would apply to the writing, and they would cut out anything that sort of didn't satisfy those requirements. So some things that you couldn't write about. You're not allowed to write about race relations between black and white soldiers. You weren't allowed to write about losses in a fatalistic way, right? They didn't want the American reader to think that the war was going badly. Well, how do you tell the truth about when something's going badly when you're not supposed to? Well, what Ernie found, and I found this to be a really strategic decision on his part, was he basically described the battle as sort of like how I think a newspaperman might today write a story about the high school basketball team, like not winning the big game on Friday, right? It was sort of like, yeah, we lost, but don't worry, we're gonna regroup, we're gonna get back, and these Germans don't stand a chance. And he had to sort of find this way of keeping spirits high. Now later, during the Vietnam era, some of this reporting from North Africa comes under a different lens. And there were some critics around that time who started to see Ernie, they described him as a propagandist or even as a cheerleader for the war because he wasn't telling that whole truth about what was happening. Now, I've told this story to lots of journalists who became war correspondents because of Ernie Pyle. And they tell me, no, that's wrong. They said Ernie wasn't a cheerleader for the war, Ernie was a cheerleader for the soldier. And there's a big difference between those two. So Ernie's sort of responsibility, as he felt it, was to try to tell the stories that the soldiers wanted the American people to hear. And so during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, the Germans sort of pushed them through there. Eventually the Allies regroup, and the British come in and push the Germans to the ocean where they surrendered. So he ended up being right in his calculation. Sometimes I wonder, how would we view his reporting had the Allies lost in North Africa? We might not even read it, right? Because we would see it as hopelessly, optimistic when that was unwarranted. Well, it turned out that it was. Now, this is the view from a mountain that Ernie climbed to watch the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And you can see the way that the fields are laid out. These are olive trees that you can see sort of in the middle distance, and in the far distance is the town where the German tanks were hiding. And basically what happened was the Americans didn't know that there were German tanks, and they just sped across this open field and were picked off by artillery and by the tanks and had to retreat. And Ernie's watching all of this. And I have very little doubt that the view looked much differently than this. I think this is exactly what things look like in 1943. And so to be able to sort of climb the same mountain, sit in the same place, see the same views, and see how much has changed and how much hasn't changed. There's still bomb damage and war damage from the Battle of Kasserine Pass. You can still see bombed out tanks and vehicles that are rusting away. You can find debris in the sand. There's this gentleman who I got to meet afterwards. He's a battlefield historian from North Africa. He's constantly posting on social media all these battlefield relics that he still finds all these years later. So this is a place where the war still is visible. And in fact, one of the families that I stayed with, their family's compound was destroyed during the battle, and it's still in rubble there today. And I said, how come this was never rebuilt, or how, And they said, well, we never knew who actually blew it up, so we didn't know who to ask to fix it. So we just left it there and built something else. And so to see the kind of lasting impact that the war has had in all these places was really quite fascinating. So from North Africa, I took a boat to Sicily, just like Ernie did. And Ernie's reporting from Sicily, I think this is one of those real hinge moments for him as a war correspondent, where in North Africa, he was really an observer of the war, but it was in Sicily where he becomes more of a participant. The war means something more to him in Sicily. And there's one experience in particular that he has. He comes down with what the doctors describe as combat fever, and you can see the description of what that looks like. It's, the muscle-racking hard ground, the snatched food, sitting ill on the stomach, the heat and the flies and the dirty feet and the constant roar of engines and the perpetual moving and the never settling down and the go, go, go night and day. Right, there was this wonderful rhythm and poetic nature to some of his writing, right? It had this lyrical rhythm, but I love this line, yesterday is tomorrow, and Training is Randazzo, and when will we ever stop, and God, I'm so tired. Right? He was telling these truths in a way that other correspondents just weren't able to capture. And so he comes down with this combat fever. He's in a hospital tent, and a couple of stretcher bearers bring in a man who's very badly wounded, and they lay him down in the aisle, and then a priest comes in, and he starts to read the last rites to this soldier. And he calls him John, his name's John. And Ernie's watching this happen. And then the priest has to go read the last rites to someone else, because this is war. And Ernie has this feeling inside himself that he wants to get down and hold this man's hand as he passes away. But he decides that maybe that wouldn't be appropriate as a correspondent. Maybe he shouldn't do that. And so he basically watches the life leave this man and says it was his life's greatest regret was not being there and being with this person as they passed away. And so suddenly he's got a connection again to these soldiers in a way that other correspondents just are not able to replicate. His most interesting, I would say, series of columns from Sicily had to do with this bridge. It's a very poor picture, I apologize. But this bridge was hung in the sky. And what actually happened was, as the Germans were retreating along the northern coast of Sicily, it's very mountainous there. And there are lots of roads and tunnels and bridges. And the Germans, as they were retreating, were basically blowing up everything behind them to try to slow down the Allies. And so Sicily is sometimes called the Engineers' War, because the engineers had to repair all the bridges and all the tunnels and all the roads in order for the infantry to be able to keep moving. And so the Germans basically blew off this road. This is a sheer cliff down to the water, and they blew the road up, hoping that American vehicles would come through the tunnel and not realize that the road was missing and they would just fall off the cliff. So in 24 hours, the Army engineers built a replacement bridge, and Ernie said it was like ants, working around the clock. And they built this bridge, and this Jeep here is a Jeep containing General Truscott, who was this general here that Ernie's meeting with. And he said that he trusted his engineers so much that he was going to be the first one to cross the bridge and show that it was safe. Now, I don't know if you can tell, that doesn't look so sturdy. Sturdy enough, certainly. But there it is today. It's still there. You can drive through the tunnel. Again, it was so fun to sort of try to find these places in the wild, they called it, right? Ernie would write so much about something and with such detail that it was sometimes quite easy to find these places because they were so expertly described. So from Sicily, I traveled to Italy, and it was in Italy where Ernie wrote his most famous column. Is anyone familiar with The Death of Captain Wascow? I know the history buffs in here will. Yeah. Where is
read your book.
Oh, you did? Okay, great. So in the early 2000s, the National Society for Newspaper Columnists actually voted The Death of Captain Wascow as the greatest column written in the 20th century. And I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe when the book came out about the fact that this was the earliest example that I could find of a correspondent naming a soldier who was killed and then describing how they were killed. And again, we sort of take that for granted now because that's just the kind of storytelling that we see from war zones. But at the time, this was not necessarily accepted. We didn't even post pictures of caskets, let alone bodies, let alone describing how someone met their end. So this captain was incredibly beloved. His men loved him so much because he was the kind of captain that would never ask someone to do something that he wasn't willing to do. And he was killed during the battle for San Pietro, which is this beautiful little village in central Italy that was actually so destroyed that they left it as is, and they built the new town farther up the valley. And now you can walk around today through the ruins like it was yesterday when the battle happened. And so Captain Wascow was killed at the top of this mountain overlooking the village, and Ernie was hanging out in this little aid shed where men were getting fixed up for wounds and other things. And he met a man who had some really bad trench foot and who had been with Captain Wascow when Captain Wascow was killed. And so for 3 days, he hung out with these soldiers, hearing all these stories about Captain Wascow as they waited for the captain's body to be brought down from the mountain. Once his body was finally brought down, they laid it alongside this stone wall, and Ernie watches as the captain's men come up to the body and pay their last respects in a variety of ways. Some men, hold his hand, some, curse, some straighten the collar on his shirt. It's a very intimate, even just talking about it, like the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a very intimate, very vulnerable picture into, this very profound moment. Ernie thought that it was junk. He didn't like how it turned out. He thought that he could do much better. And he gave the column to another correspondent, and the other correspondent said, Ernie, if this is what your work looks like when you think you're all done up, then the rest of us ought to just go home, because none of us can do this. So this was the mountain. This is Mount Semicro. And this would have been close to the view that we would have had from the aid station. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, that's some of the ruins that are still left from San Pietro. And there's this picture in the bottom right here. This is actually a rusted cap from an artillery shell. So what I found out after the fact, after I had climbed this mountain, was that the mountain is covered in unexploded ordnance. And that there's, you can see sort of, it's right on the other side of this tree line, there's actually a barbed wire fence, which I didn't know was to keep out. I thought it was just there, because there's some cattle sort of walking around in this area. So apparently it's quite dangerous to hike there. And in fact, a few years before I was there, on the other side of the mountain, there was a small fire, and it actually ignited some of the bombs that were still buried there. It happens fairly regularly that the fire department is actually trained in taking apart unexploded ordnance because it happens often enough in central Italy. Now, I think this was the spot where Captain Wascow was killed, and it's high above the cloud line. And so if you think about, this is basically, up at the top there, it's only about 4,000 feet of elevation gain, but it's like almost straight up. And they had to use donkeys to get supplies up and to bring the bodies down. I just had to grab things and pull, basically. That was the strategy. Now, Captain Wascow, I know it doesn't show up very well here on the bottom right, but Captain Wascow is buried in the Sicily Rome American Cemetery Memorial, which is in Nettuno, Italy. And when I went to visit this, the caretaker of the cemetery, I said, I'd like to visit Captain Waskow's grave. He said, you and everybody else. And there are people on a weekly basis, 80 years after the fact, who pilgrimage to this cemetery so that they can pay their respects to Captain Waskow. And it happens so often, in fact, that they don't let you rub the sand into the stone because so many people were doing it that it was like rubbing the letters off of the stone faster than they were hoping they would. So again, all these years later, Ernie still has an impact, his stories still matter, people still travel from all over the world to find these places to go visit these men. It was a really, I don't know if anyone's ever been to an American cemetery overseas, but they are incredibly well maintained. The American Battlefields and Monuments Commission manages all of those, and I believe the last time I checked there were 26, I think, cemeteries from around the world. Those are from World War I and World War II. I visited, I think, 6 total, and every time I visited one, I was totally blown away by just how much dedication and how much precision and attention to detail and how much respect and honor and dignity there is at these different places. So, we know that Ernie decides to head back to the Pacific. He gets home from France and he thinks that he's going to stay home. He sort of hints at maybe he will cover the Pacific, but maybe not. And there was a ton of pressure on him to make up his mind quickly so that they could make a plan for what he was going to do. Now around the same time, his wife Jerry was probably at her sickest in terms of her bipolar disorder, and she attempted suicide in a pretty grisly way. Was unsuccessful, but was institutionalized right after that. And the doctor didn't think that it was appropriate for Ernie to visit her in the institution. And Ernie was, at that point, so famous. It's hard for me to overstate how famous he was. So just to put some things in perspective. He wrote for about 300 different daily newspapers that carried his column, and about 200 weekly newspapers that carried his column. He had 2 best-selling books. Like I said, Hollywood was making a movie about him. He was given honorary PhDs from the University of New Mexico and from Indiana University. He won a Pulitzer. He was the Indiana Hoosier of the Year 3 years in a row, right? He was having all of these accolades heaped onto him. He was getting offers to do radio shows that would pay him so much money that he'd never have to work again after a year or 2. He was a celebrity journalist before we had celebrity journalists. And his newspaper his column was featured in 98 of the biggest 100 cities in the United States. And they always carried a picture of him with his column. And so wherever he would go, people would recognize him. He would get sacks full of letters delivered to his house every day. People would drive up to his house and honk and wave and hope that he would step outside and say hello. His phone rang off the hook. There were always people knocking on the door. And at one point, he writes a letter to his best friend and says, it's easier being at war than it is being home. And once Jerry was institutionalized, that really was kind of the final thing that he considered before deciding to go to the Pacific. And I don't think that Ernie had any kind of death wish or anything, but I do think that he was so bogged down by the war that maybe part of him didn't really care anymore what happened to him. So he goes to the Pacific, he's covering the Navy, he's staying on ships, he's going to all these different islands, and he feels like he's just kind of losing whatever it was that his columns had that really captivated people. And he thought that he needed to go back into the action just so that he could write the kind of columns that people had grown to expect from him. And so he joins the Marines for the first time during the Battle of Okinawa. And remember I told you the Marines go up north first, and they don't have much action up there. And so Ernie sort of sees this as like, the sign that he should be done, that he did his last landing, he did his last battle, he came out unscathed. That's it. He's not taking chances anymore. So he goes back onto a ship that's floating off the coast of Okinawa. He changes out of his muddy clothes, he gets fresh clothes, he starts writing his columns, and then for some reason he decides to go on one more excursion. And we don't know exactly why he decided to, because he was pretty adamant in his letters home to his wife and to his editor that he was not going to do any more frontline coverage. But another correspondent named Robert Sherrod was with Ernie at that time, and he said that he believed that a soldier had asked Ernie to go along with them, and that Ernie never said no to a soldier. And so he goes along on this this sort of miniature invasion of a tiny island off the northwest coast of Okinawa, and he is riding in a Jeep, and the Jeep comes under fire from a Japanese machine gunner. The men pile out of the Jeep, they dive into the ditches on either side, and the sniper, the machine gunner sort of zooms in on Ernie, and he's hit in the back of the head and is killed while he's slouched down in the ditch. At the time, his body was very difficult to recover. Men fought to recover Ernie's body. He was initially buried on that tiny island called Ishima, and then his body was eventually moved to the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii. And there are many things about his final burial place that I think are really interesting and appropriate. The first is he has a very simple gravestone. This reflects the sort of simple man that he was and that he wanted people to remember him for being. There was a group of people at the time who actually raised a bunch of money to build this huge monument to Ernie in Bloomington, Indiana, and his wife Jerry said, no, absolutely not. Ernie would never want that. He didn't want to be famous for what he did. He didn't want people to think that that's what he would have wanted. And so he has this very simple gravestone. You can see he was awarded the Purple Heart. He was a civilian awarded the Purple Heart. That doesn't happen very often. Normally that's reserved for actual military service members. And then the last thing you can't see from the picture, but Ernie is buried between two unknown soldiers. And so I think that there's something really great about that, because when I would go to these cemeteries, I would always hear from the caretakers that there are so many people buried there that nobody ever visits, right? Because the cemeteries are overseas, sometimes they're hard to get to. Sometimes, these were people that didn't have children or whatever the reasons were. And so the fact that this is the most visited gravesite in the Punch Bowl Cemetery, and then those two unknown soldiers also have visitors every single day, again, I think that would have been something that Ernie would have really appreciated. And luckily, that's the last slide, so you don't have to worry. I'm happy to take any questions you might have, whether it's about Ernie or about travel or about World War II in general, and I'm an open book, so yes.
You mentioned Robert Capa. Did Ernie travel with a photographer? Was that part of his storytelling?
He did with Robert Capa, but not in any other theater of war. I think it was because him and Robert were friends, and they traveled basically along from Omaha Beach to the Cherbourg invasion, and they were just together at the time. But when Robert Capa finds out that Ernie was killed, he goes on this roaring drunk, and it feels a lot less certain about his own future, because he felt like if Ernie got it, then any one of us is, could get it next. Yeah, there's great stories about all the wonderful friendships that Ernie had with other correspondents and with other photographers. There wasn't a competitive bone in his body. But at the same time, he was doing the kind of work that only he was doing.
How did they get their stories to publishers? I mean, there's no electronic communications, and there's a war going on.
Sure.
So how did that happen so quickly?
So in the early days, they actually put the columns in, like airmail bags, and they put them on ships and sent them back to the United States. That obviously took a long time. So as the war progressed, the technology developed a little bit more, and they started relaying the columns using Morse code over the telegraph wires. And then they also used radio frequencies where they would read the piece into a telephone and it would be picked up in the United States and someone would transcribe it. But to give you a sense of how long this took, for D-Day, Ernie's first column about D-Day came out on June 17th. So it took 11 days from D-Day until his first column came out. And there were lots of newspapers that actually put little captions in their newspaper that said, "We haven't yet received Ernie's dispatches from Normandy, but we expect them soon." Right? And so, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine today with instant access to information, but people had to wait a week or 10 days to find out what was happening. So it was definitely an arduous process. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and have you seen the movie Patton, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
The beginning of the movie is the massacre at Kasserine Pass.
Yes.
And you see the Bedouins going through all this.
Yes.
Is that pretty much what Ernie Pyle found when he got there?
Yes. Yeah, he writes, in fact, quite a bit about how lots of the soldiers that were killed in battle would be stripped almost naked. All their stuff would be taken by the Arabs that were in that area because it was a very poor country. And even to this day, you can find World War II surplus, essentially, for sale in different parts of the country. Yeah. And sometimes I get a question about, how did Ernie Pyle feel about Patton? We brought up Patton. Ernie never wrote a single word about Patton. Not a single word. Which I'm sure for someone like Patton was like really bothersome, right? Because he thought he was the greatest. And if the best war correspondent refuses to write about him. Now, Ernie told his editor that the reason he wasn't fond of Patton was because Patton had slapped his soldiers in Sicily. There were 2 soldiers that he slapped for malingering. And Ernie felt like that was something a general should never do. So instead of writing a column about, can you believe what George Patton did, he wrote a series of columns about General Omar Bradley and how great Bradley was. And if you know anything about Bradley and Patton, they didn't get along very well. And so for Bradley to be sort of put up on a pedestal almost by Ernie, and then Patton to be totally ignored, I think said volumes about how Ernie felt. Yeah.
You talk in sections of your book how his columns helped the common people back here who had people fighting overseas understand what the daily life is like and what these men were facing, and how eventually some of these people were diagnosed with PTSD. And I found essentially the same thing. My dad was in the South Pacific, and he would never talk about the war. You would ask him, and he'd say, no, I'm not talking about that. And I found, after both my dad and my mom died, I found my dad's war letters
Oh, no kidding.
in the attic, and they had a little black book where they had put phrases together to say, if you see I tripped and fell over a bucket, it means the Japs were bombing us.
Wow.
So they had a whole
They had a
book
whole code language.
of code language, so
Yeah.
when he wrote back in his letters, he could tell my mom
Wow.
exactly what was going on.
Right, because the letters were censored.
Because the letters were all censored. And you could see in the letters that my mom got, sometimes there would be little cutouts.
Yep.
But they didn't cut out I tripped over a bucket.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah, that's genius.
it's interesting because my dad was diagnosed with PTSD when he came back from the South Pacific. And these columns sort of helped me understand between my dad's letters and when he was writing, the common man wasn't military tactics or what was going on. It was daily stuff.
Exactly. And I found the same thing, thinking about my own grandfather's experience and getting to that sort of window into the day-to-day life. It's an incredible primary resource because there were a lot of things that soldiers couldn't write about, but Ernie could. And,
My dad could.
and he could if he did the code. I've never heard that before. That is totally
A little
fascinating.
black book, and it's got like 3 or 4 pages, and it's all code,
That's
these
amazing.
phrases, and this is what it means. Yeah.
Hopefully that'll end up in an archive
It's
somewhere.
already scanned and it's out there.
Okay, good.
And it's been donated to
Good.
historians.
Because some historian is going to go through that and it's going to blow their mind, right? And I know because I've had those experiences. So thank you for making sure that's
It's already there.
excellent. Yes?
I'm just curious that you thought, it was 80 years later, that you thought you would be able to
see as much as you did
Oh, right,
see.
right.
That, when I started the book, I was like, seriously?
Yeah.
Really? Nancy's gonna find all this stuff and
Yeah.
see all these things?
And everywhere I went there, and I probably could write another 50,000 words about things that, didn't make it into the book because they, for whatever reason didn't fit the structure. But yeah, everywhere I went, there was some memory of Ernie or his reporting or the way that the war impacted that place, was really profound. And it's very similar, I think, to what Tony Horwitz found when he started researching the Civil War, right? That there are all these places where you can still go and you can still see, and there's monuments and there's museums and there's all these, living memory, living history types of folks. That's what it's like in Europe for World War II. Yeah, it was a pleasant surprise. It would have been a lot harder book to write if I didn't find him anywhere, right? If searching for Ernie Powell was, well, I can't find him. That probably would have been as good of a read. Any other questions? You got one?
The name Bill Malden.
Yes, Bill Malden.
He wrote, his war life seems to be similar.
Yes. So Bill Malden, if you're unfamiliar, he wrote a cartoon called Willie and Joe, and Willie and Joe were these two soldiers. And there's a very similar tone to the stories that Willie and Joe tell as what Ernie was doing. And so Ernie and Bill Malden actually became friends when they were both in Italy. And Ernie introduced Bill Malden to an agent who could help him get his cartoons published in the United States. And then after Ernie was killed, Bill Malden was really devastated because it was a dear friend of his. And he famously wrote that when a soldier dies, he's mourned by the men in his platoon. But when Ernie died, he was mourned by the army. And I think, again, that just shows like what impact he had. And Bradley would sometimes say, that his men fought better when Ernie was around because they would want the better, press coverage, essentially. And so, really, I mean, Ernie did help win the war. That was his job, and he helped make that possible. I sometimes wonder what he would have done if he had survived. If the war would have ended and he would have come home. I think that if I had my way and I could have told him what to do, I think if he had been there to help tell the stories of the soldiers coming home, that might have had a big impact on a country that really wasn't interested in hearing a lot of those stories. When the war ended, lots of people were ready to just move on. It was a terrible thing, it was awful, let's move forward. Well, for a lot of people, my grandfather included, and it sounds like your family as well, it wasn't that simple. And I think if someone had been there to help translate that experience for people and essentially write those letters, maybe we would have had a different understanding, and maybe that would have been better for some of those guys. Well, thank you so much again for having me.